Spinoza and Nietzsche. So for that reason, we have this kind of constellation. And also because, for example, with some contemporary proposals, such as the one by Donna Haraway and the term worlding, maybe for some people is quite a shock to think on the possibility that this worlding is directly connected to Heidegger's philosophy. So something that maybe at the first time it seems something weird, but that connection is there as well. So if you agree, we can start with Joanna Zielińska's talk, and afterwards with the video piece. Thank you so much.
Hi, I wanted to start by saying thank you to Laura for organizing this symposium and this event, for inviting me, and a warm welcome to all the participants. I hope you've had a productive time at the whole kind of Biofrictions event over the number of days that you've been participating in it. I'm really sorry I can't be here with you in person or even live. But, you know, in the current pandemic and the difficulties with travel or being online and circumstances being what they are, I've prepared an alternative version of an encounter with you. The topic of my talk is going to be kind of life, death, and extinction. I'll be talking about ethics, specifically about a minimal ethics for the whole universe. Now, this concept may sound like a paradox, but hopefully we will make it work. Okay, so in their edited book, Making the Geological Now, Elizabeth Ellsworth and Jamie Cruz postulate something called the geological turn. And I want to start my lecture by raising a number of questions. What kind of interpellation does the proclamation of this geological turn make towards humanities scholars and artists? Should we as critical thinkers not be suspicious of such turns? Over the last few decades, certain scholars have variously identified the linguistic turn, the cultural turn, the spatial turn, the performative turn, and more recently, the materialist turn. But is the occurrence and proclamation of such turns a sign of the humanities moving on with the times, progressing and growing intellectually? Or maybe it's rather a sign of conservatively responding to what others, scientists, journalists, selected academic stars, are declaring as important. So to go back to this supposed geological turn, which I'm both confirming and questioning here, why do we have to be concerned with geology now? Isn't the situation when humanities scholars start to occupy themselves with science just asking for trouble? In that it opens up precisely the kind of excessive, non-rigorous interdisciplinarity that has gained bad reputation for cultural studies. Indeed, how should we contextualize our academic and artistic efforts if the context is provided by the whole universe? Is it not an impossible or even crazy undertaking? And yet, how could we not respond to the universe as a whole? Ellsworth and Cruz, in Making the Geological Now, recognize that an increasingly widespread turn towards the geologic as a source of explanation, motivation, and inspiration for cultural and aesthetic responses to conditions of the present moment has already taken place. So it's perhaps a little too late to consider whether we should or shouldn't do it. But what are these conditions of the present moment that these two authors are pointing to? Now, let me cite from a now quite old National Geographic article by Elizabeth Colbert, heir of the Sixth Extinction fame, kind of North American journalist, who became really well known because she put a number of concepts on the table for a wider public. And that article actually did quite a lot in a kind of wider circumstances and a wider public debate about universal or planetary issues. So the changes that, we're talking about are as follows. Probably the most significant change from a geological perspective, writes Colbert, is one that's invisible to us, the change in the composition of the atmosphere. Carbon dioxide emissions are colorless, odorless, and in an immediate sense, harmless. But their warming effects could easily push global temperatures to levels that haven't been seen for millions of years. Some plants and animals are already shifting their ranges towards the poles, and those shifts will leave traces in the fossil record. Some species will not survive the warming at all. Even if most of the Antarctic ice sheet survives, sea levels would still rise by 50 feet or more. So we could say that there is something in the air at the moment, and this something is a mixture of cosmic dust and human-induced pollution. And this something has kind of recently, the last 10 years or so, been described by many as the Anthropocene. Colbert's article in National Geographic, from which I've just cited, is very important, as I mentioned, because it introduced the term Anthropocene to a wider public. By now, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the term. It kind of appears in all sorts of places. But let us recap and reflect on, the debate around the Anthropocene, what the term actually means. Is it still useful? Do we have to respond to it? How should we respond to it? Can we reimagine the Anthropocene and the ongoing debate about it in the process? Now, we could say that with their book, Ellsworth and Cruz are articulating an emergent cultural sensibility, an interest in geologic phenomena and scales in contemporary philosophy, architecture, art, and design, which is evident in humans starting to think more and more in terms of non-human, deep time, or cosmic time. Indeed, many contemporary philosophers, cultural theorists, and artists are currently experimenting with concepts that take up geology and geological problems as a metaphor and model. For example, when it all kind of started about 10 years ago, so House of World Cultures in Berlin ran a 2-year Anthropocene project in 2013 and 14. Then the National Academy of Science in Washington, D.C. hosted an exhibition titled Imagining Deep Time in 2014. Even more recently, an exhibition and then subsequent book catalog, World to Come, Art in the Age of the Anthropocene, curated and edited by Kerry Oliver Smith, traveled to a number of North American art galleries and institutions. So it seems that the understanding of Earth processes can offer inspiration for how we might think about the qualitatively different ways that humans are now living on a planet Earth. Ellsworth and Cruz, who alongside their more traditional book have also published this beautiful online platform with kind of more distributed way of reading through the problems, as well as visiting a lot of visuals, they are saying that these new sorts of inventive thinking and making approaches are now possible and needed in response to new material situations of daily life. And indeed, a number of artists, designers, philosophers of change and emergence are deliberately situating their aesthetic work and experimental thinking within the geologic as a condition of our present time. They are exploring ways that seek to recalibrate the human in relation to the geologic. So even if I remain somewhat suspicious about the humanities having to chase agendas defined by others, scientists, media, I'm also aware that there is something at stake with the geological, and that the Anthropocene is just too serious a business for humanities scholars to ignore. Over the last kind of 10 years, I've been working on developing possible responses to this exhortation to humanities scholars and artists to take the geological seriously. So one of my responses has taken the form of a small book titled Minimal Ethics for the Anthropocene, which also includes an art project. The book is published by Open Humanities Press, and as all of their books, it's available for free to download an electronic version. So I would encourage you to go and visit the Open Humanities Press's website, openhumanitiespress.org, because there are lots of books about the kind of climate change, Anthropocene, and all sorts of global issues approached from a kind of humanities perspective. Now, before I move on to the theoretical part of my argument proper, I wanted to show you, by way of contextualizing the issues that concerns me today in a different medium, and show you a recent art project of mine. And just to explain, I'd always had a passion for photography, but in 2007, I plucked up the courage and enrolled on the MA in Photographic Studies at the University of Westminster, from which I graduated in 2009. And this encouraged me to not just continue writing about challenging established paradigms of thought, boundary crossing and paradigm shifting hybrids, but actually try and enact such a shift in my own work. So I traveled from being a theorist to being an artist, and then it kind of all merged into some third different mode of doing work. So I started practicing cultural theory as if it was art, while attempting to think of art making and image making as a way of theorizing with a different medium. And this relationship between foreground and background, object and context, shifts radically in this approach. So the project I put in the book is called Topia Dedala. This series of images explores various forms of manufactured landscape. Taken from two vantage points on both sides of a window, the composite images interweave human and non-human creativity by overlaying the outer world of cloud formation with the inner space of sculptural arrangement, remediating the tradition of the sublime as embraced by Turner's landscape paintings and Ansel Adams's national park photographs. The series foregrounds the inherent manufacturedness of what counts as landscape and of the conventions of its visual representation. Through this, Topia Dedala performs a micro-sublime for the Anthropocene era, a period in which the human has become identified as a geological agent. It also raises questions for the role of plastic as both construction material and debris in the age of petrochemical urgency. So my book, Minimal Ethics for the Anthropocene, which also includes this photographic project I'm now showing you, is about the future and also about the very possibility of there being a future for humans, non-humans, and last but not least, for life itself. The book arose out of my earlier work on ethics, where ethics for me is more about posing questions about life, both in its social and biological aspects, than about telling people how to live. It's therefore ethics and not morality, or worse, moralism, that I'm concerned with today. So on to the more philosophical arguments and on how to do scholarship, art, and everything else in the context of the whole universe, and why this context matters quite a lot. Now, arguably, life comes to the fore most explicitly when it is under threat. We think about life instead of just continuing to live it when faced with the prospect of death, be it the death of individuals due to illness, accidents, old age, or the pandemic, the whole ethnic or national groups dying in wars and other forms of armed conflict, but also deaths of whole populations, be it human or non-human ones. And it's the narrative about the impending death of the human population that is about the extinction of the human species, but also of other species alongside the human, that is of particular interest to me in the context of this talk on life and minimal ethics. In mainstream media, the problem of extinction is usually presented as something inevitable. In the words of British scientist Stephen Emmett, head of Microsoft's computational science research and author of the book 10 Billion, which arose from a successful stage play, the current situation in which the human species finds itself can be most adequately described with a rather blunt phrase: we are fucked. The reasons for this supposed state of events are as follows. Earth is home to millions of species. Just one dominates it, us. Our cleverness, our inventiveness, and our activities have modified almost every part of our planet. In fact, we are having a profound impact on it. Indeed, our cleverness, our inventiveness, and our activities are now the drivers of every global problem we face. And every one of these problems is accelerating as we continue to grow towards a global population of 10 billion. In fact, I believe we can rightly call the situation we are in right now an emergency, an unprecedented planetary emergency. Okay, so that was a quote from Emmett. So this unique situation, or rather geohistorical period, in which humans are said to have become the biggest threat to life on Earth, has been described precisely as the Anthropocene. Emmett's practical solution to this situation is also quite blunt. Given that any possible technological or behavioral solutions to the current state of events, even if theoretically possible, are unlikely to work, the advice he would give his son would be to buy a gun. This is, of course, a powerful story, the goal of which is to shock and awe us into action. Now, without shooting our gun-wielding messenger, we should point out that there seems to be something narcissistic about the Jeremiads of these kinds and those that tell them. Also, we humans have produced narratives about different forms of the apocalypse ever since we developed the ability to tell stories and record them. So my aim with this project on the minimal ethics is to tell a different story about the world and our human positioning in it and with it, while taking seriously what science has to tell us about life and death. I am mindful of philosopher John Gray's admonition in his Guardian review of Emmett's book that the planet doesn't care about the stories that humans tell themselves. It responds to what humans do and is changing irreversibly as a result. Gray is no doubt correct in his skepticism. Yet it should be noted that we humans do care about the stories we tell ourselves. More importantly, stories have a performative nature. They can enact and not just describe things, even if there are, of course, limits to what they are capable of enacting. My book on minimal ethics is one such story about life and death at both macro and micro scales, shaped into a set of philosophical propositions for non-philosophers. More specifically, its aim is to outline a viable position on ethics as a way of living a good life when life itself is said to be under a unique threat. In other words, it's a story about how we can live a good life at this geohistorical moment that is currently being described as the Anthropocene, and about what constitutes the goodness of such a life. The injunction to outline some kind of the teaching of the good life when life itself is said to be under threat comes to me partly from Theodor Adorno's Minima Moralia, a 1944 slim volume by the Frankfurt philosopher, written as a gift to his friend and collaborator Max Horkheimer, and subtitled Reflections on a Damaged Life. On one level, Adorno's diagnosis seems to be similar in tenor to Emmett's. Adorno writes, "Life has changed into a timeless succession of shocks, interspaced with empty, paralyzed intervals. But nothing, perhaps, is more ominous for the future than the fact that, quite literally, these things will soon be past thinking on for each trauma of the returning combatants, each shock not inwardly absorbed is a ferment of future distraction." Karl Kraus was right to call his play The Last Days of Mankind. What is being enacted now ought to bear the title After Doomsday. So that's a quote from Adorno, remember 1944. It's a very different political, social, economic and planetary climate. Yet the context of Adorno's reflections themselves, presented in a series of fragments and what we might call as shards of thought, is very unique. They spring from what he perceived as life's catastrophic and irreparable distraction in the Holocaust, bemoaning the fact that others are already envisaging the possibility of rebuilding culture as if the murder of millions of Jews had been just an unpleasant interlude. He sees modern life as reduced to the sphere of the private and then merely consumption, a state of events that leads to alienation and the withdrawal of vitality from life itself. Citing the Austrian writer Ferdinand Grünberger, Adorno laments that life does not live. But Adorno doesn't stop because of that. Instead, he goes on looking for life's traces buried in language and for the possibility of continuing with critical thought and writing, with a determination to teach us about the good life, even if on a very small scale. Now, my own project on minimal ethics draws inspiration from Adorno's persistence in minima moralia to keep philosophizing as if against all odds, to look for signs of life in the middle of an apocalypse, even if my own context and the existential threats that shape it are very different from his. The ambition and orientation of my ethical propositions also differ from Adorno's. Even though I embrace the critical spirit of his work, I will turn to various philosophies of life, as well as feminist thought, in order to outline a more affirmative framework for the times when life is said to find itself under threat on a planetary scale. My aim here is for us to consider to what extent we can make life go on, and also how we ourselves can continue to live well, while interrogating what it means to live life well, and whether such consensus can be reached, and more importantly, whether someone's or some species' good life isn't also an apocalypse and a holocaust for another species. Now, it needs to be said that this very we of my argument is also already posited as a problem, referring as it does to what philosophy and common sense have designated as humans, but also opening onto a complex and dynamic network of relations in which we humans are produced as humans and in which we remain entangled with non-human entities. The direct inspiration for my project comes from a wedding of eco-sex artists Beth Stevens and Annie Sprinkle, who married Lake Kalavesi, which is part of the Iso-Kala Lake system in northern Savonia in Finland, at the Anti-Contemporary Art Festival in Kuopio in Finland on the 30th of September in 2012. And I wrote a short piece on minimal ethics as a wedding gift for them. So this is how this little book started. This human non-human wedding between more than two parties wasn't Stevens and Sprinkle's first. In previous ceremonies, they had married the earth, the sea, the snow, and the rocks, thus playfully taking on and enacting what Donna Haraway calls the nature-cultural kinship, but one in which love is not enough. Stevens and Sprinkle's queer performance serves here as an entry point into a different mode of philosophizing, one that borrows from artistic sensibilities and that produces ideas with things and events rather than just with words. This mode of philosophical production is necessarily fragmented. It gives up on any desire to forge systems, ontologies, or worlds, and makes itself content with minor, even if abundant, interventions into material and conceptual unfoldings. A minimal ethics I've attempted to outline is one such possible intervention. The mode of working I'm employing here mobilizes what could be termed a post-masculinist rationality, a more speculative, less directional mode of thinking and writing. This notion develops from the Canadian thinker Darren Barney's concept of post-masculinist courage. For Barney, courage that is post-masculinist is not necessarily therefore feminine or even really post-masculine, though it's very likely to be feminist. Barney's call is in turn inspired by political theorist Wendy Brown, who has outlined a vision for a post-masculinist politics in which freedom is reconciled with love and recognition. Such politics requires much courage and willingness to risk. So Barney suggests this sort of courage needs to be distinguished from the sort of bravado whereby men seek to exert control over everything around them by the force of instrumental rationality. Post-masculinist courage involves for him the courage to face the uncertainty of that which we can't control, the courage to be let go into action that begins something truly new and unpredictable. Now, a post-masculinist rationality is by no means non or anti-rationalist. It just calls for a different modulation of rationality, one that remains more attuned to its own modes of production. It is always already embodied and immersed, responding to the call of matter and to its various materializations such as humans, animals, plants, inanimate objects, as well as the relations between them. Such post-masculinist rationality remains suspicious towards any current attempts to return to ontology in both its idealist and materialist guises as a predominant mode of philosophizing. It sees any such attempts for what they are, ways of producing and hence also mastering the world, and then passing it on as fact to others. So the brief reflections offered today are linked to my previous work on what it means to live a good life at a time when the very notion of life is undergoing a radical reformulation, both on a philosophical and biotechnological level. But I'm less concerned today with a critical discussion of different theoretical positions on ethics, and more with sketching out an affirmative proposal for an ethics that makes sense, and that senses its own making. This idea of the ethical call of matter expands on my argument from my book Bioethics in the Age of New Media, in which I positioned bioethics as an originary philosophy situated even before ontology. That idea was inspired by the work of Emmanuel Levinas, although I remained troubled by the humanist limitations of Levinas's ethics, whereby a primordial responsibility exerted upon me always came from human others. In bioethics as an ethics of life, the way I understand it, the human self has to respond to an expanded set of obligations that affect her, make an impression on her, allow for her differentiation from the world around her, and demand a response that is not just a reaction. While I do recognize, together with other theorists of post-anthropocentric thought, that it's not all about us, I also acknowledge the singular human responsibility which is exercised both by philosophical theory, which is consciously undertaken by few, and philosophical practice, which is a much more widespread undertaking, even if not always a conscious one. So this recognition hopefully justifies to some extent the reluctant yet also sometimes inevitable use of the pronoun I in my talk, and the multiple paradoxes implied in any attempt on the part of a singular female human writer to author a post-anthropocentric ethics. The method behind my ethical project can be loosely described as critical vitalism. It involves rethinking and remaking life, both as a social construct and a carbon-based construct, and what we can do with it. Starting from the premise that everything is interconnected, as Timothy Morton has it, it also considers differentiation within those processes of connectivity. So not everything is connected in the same way, and offering a reflection on human situatedness and responsibility for different connections of relations of which she, he, they are part. Situated at the crossroads of cultural theory, media and cultural studies, continental philosophy and art, my project inscribes itself in the trajectory of what Morton has called the ecological thought. Yet still following Morton, this is a curious kind of ecology, as it's not based on any prelapsarian, romanticized notion of nature that can allegedly be recouped in order to make the world and our lives in it better. Taking such life as a yet non-valorized, historically specific minimal condition, the framework of critical vitalism I'm adopting for this project remains attuned to stoppages in life, seeing life as both a becoming and a fracturing process. If, as Tim Ingold claims, wherever there is life, there is movement, we can perhaps also add that wherever there is movement, there is also stoppage. Otherwise, how would we be able to recognize movement as movement? And it's precisely this tension between movement as an enabling force of becoming, a point we can develop not just from the philosophy of Bergson and Deleuze, but also from the anthropological thought of Ingold. So so we've got this tension between movement and stoppage as an inevitable alteration in the rhythm of life. And this tension between the two is of interest to me here. So critical vitalism considers how differences in movement and speed ensue in matter, who they matter to, how matter resists and recoils, and to what effect. In this context, ethics becomes a way of taking responsibility by the human for various sorts of thickenings of the universe across different scales, and of responding to the tangled mesh of everyday connections and relations. This is how human agency can be exercised, although we have to bear in mind that such agency is partly non-human, never fully conscious, and always entangled. Also, agency can only become theorized after the fact, becoming a designation for something happening after it happened. Agency is therefore not something humans or animals or other beings or even inanimate entities have, the way social scientists have traditionally understood it. Rather, agency is something that unfolds in the movement of life. It's a set of actions and relations through which something occurs. But there are perhaps good reasons not to give up too early on the notion of agency, even if we do not see it as separate from the multiple processes of the world's worlding. The differentiation between process and entity is always a heuristic, but it can be a useful device for humans who are involved in the pastime of thinking. It allows us to develop a discourse about what we call the world and about ourselves in that world. Agency therefore becomes something that the always emerging human can mobilize in order to develop a meaningful discourse that matters. What does it mean for the ethical framework outlined here to be pointed towards this geohistorical period described as the Anthropocene? Now, proposed by the Dutch chemist Paul Cruton in the year 2000, the term from the anthropo, meaning man or the human, and scene, new, serves as a name for a new geological epoch that supposedly follows the Holocene, the epoch that began at the end of the last ice age, 11,700 years ago, and that, officially at least, continues to this day. Now, the need for the new term was justified by many scientists by the fact that human influence upon the geo and biosphere via farming, deforestation, and urbanization, to name but a few processes, has been so immense that it actually merits a new designation in order to address the challenges raised by that influence. Even though the term hasn't been universally adopted by all geologists, its use has significantly increased over the last couple of decades and has been popularized beyond the professional scientific community thanks to that article by Colbert and the subsequent cultural and artistic interventions described earlier. Yet even amongst those who are sympathetic to the term, there is widespread doubt as to which point in time should serve as the beginning of this epoch. Some point to the early days of agriculture, some 8,000 years ago, others to the Industrial Revolution or the last 50 years of excessive consumption, whilst others still see Anthropocene as an epoch that is yet to come. So even though scientists still haven't unequivocally declared that the designation is entirely justified, though the stratigraphic committee, as part of the Geological Society, has accepted that, there are still some rumblings about when does it start, what does it really mean. The Anthropocene has already been taken up and renamed by cultural and political theorists as the Anthropocene, the Capitalocene, the Cthulhucene, the Eurocene, the Plantationocene, and the Technocene, with questions being raised rightly about the viability of its underpinning logic that doesn't exist outside structures of mourning. And that also pins a lot of conflict and a lot of trouble on the whole of humanity, while in fact it results from some very unfair processes of exploitation of one group of human over others, either through capitalism or through slavery or through industrial revolution, as it was called. So even though we are nowhere near solving the climate issues, in some areas of critical theory, we already find ourselves post-Anthropocene, it seems, again, for all the right reasons. My continued use of the term Anthropocene in this project as an ethical pointer rather than as a scientific descriptor. So in other words, the Anthropocene serves for me as a designation of the human obligation towards the geo and biosphere. So even if the Anthropocene is about the age of man, the age of the human, the ethical thinking it designates is strongly post-anthropocentric, in the sense that it doesn't consider the human to be the dominant or the most important species, nor does it see the world as arranged solely for human use and benefit. The term does, however, entail an appeal to human singularity, which is not to be confused with human superiority, coupled with a recognition that we can make a difference to the ongoing dynamic processes taking place in the biosphere and the geosphere, of which we are part. Minimal ethics for the Anthropocene is not just an updated form of environmental ethics. It doesn't pivot on any coherent notion of an environment as an identifiable entity, but rather concerns itself with dynamic relations between entities across various scales, such as stem cells, flowers, dogs, humans, rivers, electricity pylons, computer networks, and planets, to name but a few. And again, to mention what I said earlier, everything is connected, but not everything is connected in the same way. Not all connections matter in the same way. Anyway, this closest way of describing this kind of minimal ethics would be as an ethics of life, with life understood both philosophically and biologically. Its starting premise is that we as humans are making a difference to the arrangements of what we are calling the world. Naturally, we are not the only or even the most important actors that are making such a difference. It would be extremely naive and short-sighted to assume that, as would be to assume that we can affect or control any occurrences within that world. But we are perhaps uniquely placed to turn the making of such difference into an ethical task. Thanks to our human ability to tell stories and to philosophize, we can not only grasp the deep historical stratification of values through an involvement in what Deleuze and Guattari called a geology of morals, but also work out possibilities for making better differences across various scales. While our participation in the differentiation of matter is ongoing, frequently collective or distributed, and often unconscious, ethics names the situation when those processes of differentiation are accounted for, when they occur as a cognitive affective effort to rearrange the solidified moral strata with a view to producing a better geomoral landscape, one that sustains not only us humans, but also other beings, as well as itself. So ethics is therefore a form of managing the movement of life, performed from within life itself. The ethics discussed here is minimal in the sense that it's non-systemic, so it doesn't remain rooted in any large conceptual system, and non-normative, which is to say, it doesn't rest on any fixed prior values, nor does it postulate any firm values in the process. Inevitably, for some people, a non-normative ethics may be a conceptual blind alley that will not deliver what it promises. For me, in turn, non-normativity is the only possible way of thinking ethics and life generally in a responsible and non-hubristic way, from amidst life itself. But wary of capital V values, I nevertheless embark on this project with one minimal assumption, a conviction that we have a responsibility to engage with life, materially and conceptually, because as we know from Socrates, the unexamined life is not worth living. What counts as the examination of life goes beyond the Socratic method of inquiry instantiated between two parties with a view to eliminating erroneous hypotheses. It also involves physicalist engagement with the matter of life, with its particles and unfoldings. Minimal ethics for the Anthropocene is to serve as a caution against understanding the Anthropocene too well and too quickly, as well as knowing precisely how to solve the problems it carries. The task of such minimal ethics, as argued earlier, is to pose the Anthropocene as an ethical injunction. However, this injunction also entails the requirement to remain critical towards the very concept of the Anthropocene and the way it's framed in the current debates, both academic and mainstream ones, not in order to reject it, but in order to develop a more complex and more responsible discourse on the Anthropocene, as well as facilitating a better political response to it. The three issues that require particular attention, as already discussed throughout the book, are the underpinnings masculinism, solutionism, and scientism of Anthropocene, all manifested, to return to a quote from Darren Barney, in the sort of bravado whereby men seek to exert control over everything around them by the force of instrumental rationality. So the interpellation here is not to promote women-only activism, suspend any search for solutions, or bash science. It's to keep only a check on some of the excesses that have come to the fore in the debate on the subject to date. The conclusion that emerges from above is that critical thinking is one of the forms that politics of the Anthropocene has to take. And indeed, perhaps thinking is the most political thing we can do with regard to the Anthropocene before we go and do anything else. This shouldn't be mistaken for a sign of resignation or quietism in the face of a planetary task. As philosopher Dave Boothroyd observes, thinking is doing something, even if from the outside it looks like doing nothing. So the recognition of the non-necessity of the universe and of the emergence of life, including conscious life in it, doesn't diminish our human responsibility for this medium-sized planet we call home and its surroundings, or for its human and non-human inhabitants. But it does potentially strip any mode of philosophizing about it of a certain explanatory and interventionist hubris. This kind of post-anthropocentric standpoint poses a challenge to human exceptionalism, but it also remains accountable, to cite Karen Barad, for the role we play in the differential constitution and differential positioning of the human among other creatures, both living and non-living. So even though it's not all about us, we humans have a singular responsibility to give an account of the differentiations of matter, of which we are part. Ethics is therefore constitutively linked with poetics, because it comes to us through images and stories, that is, through narratives of different genre and kinds. The poetic role of art, where the Greek term poiesis stands for bringing forth or creation, should be recognized here as fundamentally world-making, rather than merely aesthetic or ornamental. The minimalism of the ethics project presented to you today doesn't therefore just refer to the premises of its main argument, but also to its form. Aimed as an exercise in brevity, it adopts a formal structure that comprises 21 theses. The aim here is to say just enough. Also, as I explained a moment ago, for me there exists a strong link between ethics and poetics, which is something we can learn from philosophers such as Derrida, Heidegger, from feminist thinkers such as Luz Irigaray, Alon Sixu. And this is why I would like to encourage you to listen to these 21 theses on minimal ethics as if you were listening to poetry. Minimal ethics for the Anthropocene. The universe is constantly unfolding, but it also temporarily stabilizes into entities. None of the entities are pre-planned or necessary. Humans are one class of such entities, which is as accidental and transitory as any other class. The differentiation between process and entity is a heuristic, but it allows us to develop a discourse about the world, and about ourselves in that world. The world is an imaginary name we humans give to the multitude of unfoldings of matter. Transitory stabilizations of matter do matter to us humans, but they don't all matter in the same way. Ethics is a historically contingent human mode of becoming in the world and of becoming different from the world. Ethics is therefore stronger than ontology. It entails becoming something in response to there being something else, even though this something else is only a temporary stabilization. This response is not just discursive, but also affective and corporeal. Ethics is necessary because it is inevitable. We humans must respond to there being other processes and other entities in the world. Our response is a way of taking responsibility for the multiplicity of the world and for our relations to and with it. Such responsibility can always be denied or withdrawn, but a response will have already taken place nonetheless. Responsibility is not just a passive reaction to pre-existing reality. It involves actively making cuts to the ongoing unfolding of matter in order to stabilize it. Material incisions undertaken by humans can be ethical decisions, even if the majority of such cuts into matter are nothing of the kind. Even if ethics is inevitable, ethical events are rare. Ethics requires an account of itself. Ethics precedes politics, but also makes a demand on the political as the historically specific order of at times collaborative and at times competitive relations between human and non-human entities. As a practice of material and conceptual differentiation, ethics entails violence, but it should also work towards minimizing violence. There is therefore value in ethics, even if ethics itself needs no prior values. Ethics is a critical mobilization of the creative principle of life in order to facilitate a good life. Ethics enables the production of better modes of becoming, whose goodness is worked out by humans in the political realm in relation with and with regard to non-human entities and entanglements. Thank you. I hope it's been useful and productive, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the seminar. Thank you for having me.
The belief in seemingly interminable growth has led to depletion, scarcity, and the crisis of biological and social life. This apocalyptic state of events has been called the Anthropocene. Stretching back at least 250 years to the early days of fossil fuel excavation and burning, the Anthropocene can't be seen, and hence known, by us contemporary humans, because of the vastness of time across which it has unfolded. It can only be visualized, singularly yet repeatedly. Such visualizations usually draw on apocalyptic tropes straight from the Book of Revelation, images of the blackening of the sun, of heaven falling onto the earth, of lands being moved out of their places. Yet they only show us what we are capable of seeing, while hiding the most dramatic message of the Anthropocene, the end of man and everything else. No picture can convey the fact that soon there will be nothing to see, and no one to see it. Current Anthropocene visuality ultimately has a mollifying effect. We are thus slowly being appeased into accepting the status quo, about the condition of our planet. We are also being persuaded that salvation from the Anthropocene's finalism will soon arrive from a godlike elsewhere. It will either take the form of an escape to heavens, in the form of planetary relocation, or it will happen via an actual upgrade of humans to the status of gods. In both of these Silicon Valley-fueled prophecies, man arrives in the technological New Jerusalem fully redeemed and redesigned. In the humanist imperialism of the Anthropocene era, man has thus succeeded in elevating himself above the complex planetary processes to reclaim a divine position, that of the maker and destroyer of worlds. But he achieves his godlike status at the cost of sacrificing sexual and biological difference, disavowing his kinship with women and those of non-binary gender, with animals, fungi and microbes. The man of the neo-apocalypse emerges standing, proudly erect. This disavowal of cross-gender and cross-species kinship is a condition for the preservation of man's self-belief and self-appointed authority, allowing him continued dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth. Should we therefore panic about the end of man, or should we rather welcome it, and maybe question what it is that is actually ending? Shouldn't we rather try and chip away at the apocalyptic habit that is also the foundation of man's fictitious authority? Is it not time to reclaim and rewrite the prophecy about the end of man? One way to start may be by challenging the widespread belief that salvation from the current planetary apocalypse will come from another place. Such outsider solutions are not just being proposed by high-tech entrepreneurs on their celestial missions. They are also part of our current political landscape, with its procession of strongmen that are promising us earthly redemption and perpetual abundance. Could we instead envisage something like a feminist counter-apocalypse? Adopting precarity as the fundamental condition of living in the global post-industrial world, the feminist counter-apocalypse would contest many of the currently proposed outsider solutions. It would also reposition the standalone subject of ethics and politics as always already multiple, strange, and strange to itself. Such a subject doesn't have to open itself to others because it is already contaminated by them, but it does have to grasp this relationship as being mutually constitutive and therefore as involving a call to responsibility for others. The responsibility for others and the willingness to be vulnerable to them are premised on recognizing that entanglement with others is not just a matter of our acceptance or goodwill, because it precedes the emergence of the human self. The end of man prophecy doesn't therefore point so much to the extinction of the human species, but rather to the expiration of the white Christian man as the key subject of history. The feminist counter-apocalyptic agenda promises liberation from the form of subjectivity that is pinned to a competitive, overachieving, and overreaching masculinity. It opens up to the precarious lives and bodies of human and non-human others, including the male bodies and minds that have been discarded in the downsiding process of disruptive semio-capitalism. Because under the current conditions, we all need to ask, if unbridled progress is no longer an option, what kinds of coexistences and collaborations do we want to create in its aftermath?
He was Jewish and she was Roman Catholic, but we were brought up totally Roman Catholic. The whole family went to Mass on Sunday, including my father.